What's Really Going On? July 9, 2019 by Anna von Reitz. A lengthy and wide-ranging answer to a simple question from my German readers. The estate trusts they established for us without our knowledge or consent were housed in Puerto Rico, but those were not the only primary derivatives they created in our names. The Sestuike Vi trusts were named like this, John Mark Doe. Those were what they bankrupted in 2015. There are also public transmitting utilities named like this, John M. Doe. That is what they are using to address us now. And the third primary derivative is a public charitable trust doing business as John Doe. These three things represent our private property, our energy, and our public property interests respectively. This was all done based on fraud and is owed immediate cessation and correction, but that is not so easy to do en masse, because this is the way the governments have been funding themselves and giving themselves access to your credit. Without that or control of that, they are cut back down to size and can no longer function as plenary oligarchies. It requires a return to individual national governments or conversion of this nasty brand of corporate feudalism into something totally new. The Pope's plan has been to gradually consolidate power in regional governments, for example, the so-called North American Union of US, Mexico, and Canada, and the EU in Europe. These unions are supposed to promote regional peace and mutual dependency, so suddenly instead of 210 independent national governments we suddenly have 10. And we have all the problems we have in the EU. Some members of these forced regional alliances are weaker and less competent to manage their situation than others for all sorts of reasons, which forces the more developed and self-disciplined countries to be forever picking up the slack for the weaker members without, however, having any political power sufficient to change the policies or practices of their dependents. Think US and Mexico, or Germany and Greece, and you will have a pretty accurate view of the problem. Instead of working together cooperatively to solve problems and share regional resources to do it, what happens in the real world is that the strong carry the weak and live like parents trying to deal with profligate teenagers. Look at what has recently gone on between Mexico and the US. Mexico is sympathetic to the plight of Honduras, but unwilling or unable to do much for the Hondurans itself. So they open their southern border and let the Hondurans traipse through Mexico to our southern border. Mexico's moral dilemma and expense has been passed into us. So we either have to pay off Mexico to close its southern border, which we have done, or we have to build a border wall to be able to control immigration into our country. Either way we get stuck paying some other country to do what they should be doing anyway, or we have to pay for an expensive construction project that should not be necessary, but which is being forced on us by the actions of a weak member of a forced regional union. The planners responsible for all this don't have a firm grasp of human nature, nor do they understand cultural and political realities. Just because the US and Mexico are physical neighbors does not mean that we have a lot in common beyond location on the globe, but the planners ignore this fact and continue to merrily meddle in the affairs of what should be sovereign nations, promoting Christian ideals of strong nations caring for less fortunate neighbors, etc., without any respect for free will and responsibility. If we are going to help Hondurans, it should be our free will decision to do so, not something thrown at us like a tubful of dirty bath water. And it should be the responsibility of the Honduran government and the Mexican government to make the best decisions they can make, too, not just a shiftless pass the problem on to the Americans attitude. These are their people and their neighbors. Lack of responsibility at home just leads to more lack of responsibility worldwide. It's the same situation with the Germans and the Greek crisis. The Greek government instituted all sorts of free government giveaways that made them very popular politically at home, but left the question of who pays for it on the doorstep of the German people simply because they are participating as members of the EU regional government experiment. A logical man or woman knows that it does no good to simply transplant a problem from one location to another, because the source of the problem travels along like a flea on a dog. An alcoholic living in Phoenix, Arizona, is not magically transformed into a healthy, addiction-free man by moving to Anchorage, Alaska. It's the same with bad political ideas and immoral attitudes and beliefs, other kinds of addictions, lack of education, lack of skills, poor health, and so on. A change in location may encourage new thinking or development of new skills, etc., but there is no guarantee of that. It may simply broaden the spread of the problem, like giving Typhoid Mary relocation expenses and a bus pass. Transferring the Greek debt to German backs does nothing to teach the Greek government better habits, and simply deprives Germans of rewards they have justly earned. Transferring Hondurans to the United States simply imports Honduran gangs and diseases and bad attitudes and communist rhetoric to a new location and creates a problem for Americans that is by no means a natural problem for us. And all this humanitarian effort to import and mainstream Muslims from the Middle East to Europe has done nothing to bring their 7th century lifestyle and religious belief system into the modern era. All it has done is create more tension, more strife, more cultural malaise, more unjust debt, and more problems for people who were, more or less, making it on their own, until the planners got busy and made a mess of it, again. A more certain and sensible approach is to open up opportunities in the home country or along the borders shared with immediate neighbors, not a wholesale forced resettlement and migration plan cooked up by elitists who are ill-equipped to deal with practical life. One is reminded of clueless Marie Antoinette blithely and with good intentions saying, "Let them eat cake." Because she saw no reason that the crowds of hungry peasants couldn't eat cake. She was generous and ignorant and was more than willing that they should all sit down and have all the cake they wanted. It is the same with the planners and their meddling in the Middle East. Well, the Europeans need workers and the Muslims need a place to go, now that we have bombed their homelands into smithereens. Why not just move the Muslims to Europe and create an instant underclass of cheap labor alienated from the native population in as many ways as possible? Racially, culturally, and religiously different. Then isolate them in burgeoning slums like rats in a trap and see what comes of it? As if any sane person doesn't already know what comes of it. How about the planners stop bombing and meddling and playing war games in the Middle East? How about they rebuild the Middle East and let it be at peace and encourage all the Muslims to return home to their own countries and their own cultures? Israel is not the consequence of God leading the Hebrews to the Promised Land. Israel is the consequence of British and Catholic planners run amok. So now we have untold billions of dollars invested in another failed experiment and the political and human consequences of that experiment on our hands, and it should not even concern us. The whole problem of Israel v. the neighbors wouldn't even exist without the meddling and self-service and elitist ignorance of the planners. The Creator loves diversity. Crocuses bloom along with lilacs and apple trees, lilies bloom with pansies and petunias. Why in blazes can't we be allowed to blossom in our ways and forms and seasons? And homelands? That would be too simple, too natural, too healthy, too outside the control of the self-appointed, self-important planners. Who made the Pope and the Queen the great mixmasters, plopping down Jews in the middle of the Arab homelands and then plopping down Arabs in the middle of French and German homelands? And now that they see the results of their handiwork and planning and everyone else is ready to take them to task for their meddling, they want to beat feet home and tend to their knitting? They want a no-deal Brexit backed up with American military power and the continuation of the Lateran Treaty, though we all know what a den of thieves has been operating out of Vatican City. The Roman Catholic Church since Charlemagne has never grasped the fact that you cannot force conversion of the heart. Their killing and stealing for Jesus logic fault got even worse in the wake of the Inquisition and Ignatius Loyola. Their partial success at conversion by necessity has encouraged a tragic and misguided history of intrigue, violence, oppression and flawed logic on the part of some factions within the Church. And unfortunately, aided by closet Satanist cells within the Church, that basic idea that you can force beliefs and values on others and mandate the behavior of men and nations by force of arms and monetary blackmail continues. Whatever the Pope considers to be good becomes the mandate, and you wind up with irresponsible nations feeding upon responsible nations, a recipe that doesn't help or teach the miscreants better behavior, but which does serve to reduce everyone to a commonality of misery while discouraging those who are trying to do better. We are dealing a form of extreme communism egged on with very repressive fascist moral overtones, a worst of all political worlds, synergy that has been exemplified already by the Nazis, who borrowed vast amounts of money, then murdered their priority creditors in cold blood, shared out the ill-gotten gains with the Swiss bankers, the Pope, and the Queen, and found themselves in key positions in the US government and scientific community, still suffering under the delusion that they were right and good and everyone else was stupid and wrong. Getting back to your original question, the American estates have been claimed by the Americans. The British territorial government DBA, in our names, as the United States of America, is attempting to horn in and take a middleman position, and we are objecting to their presumptions and keeping the pressure on the Pope and the municipal United States government, which has similarly been doing business in our names as the United States. Our process was to seize upon and collapse the municipal trusts, including the states of states, then enclose the state of state franchises, then roll them all back onto the land jurisdiction of the actual unincorporated and sovereign government in international jurisdiction, the United States of America, notice the our proper name, and from there conveyed all the way back to the soil jurisdiction states of the United States, again notice the and reassignment of the assets. There isn't a power on earth that can say one word about it, because these are our assets and we have claimed them fair and square, and we are not incorporated. We are fact, they are fiction. So, now the Americans, the actual, factual Americans, not the U.S. citizens, who are the rightful heirs of the actual states and all derivative property, have exposed the whole international criminal enterprise that was afoot, and we have claimed back our inheritance, and we have no obligation to serve our servants anymore. Instead, there will be a performance review and new contract negotiations. We are finally getting back on track after 150 years of this betrayal of trust. Fortunately or unfortunately, because we were the first victims of the scheme, we were also chosen as the staging ground for the unfoldment of the patent and copyright and trademark abuses that have been implemented by the criminals as a means of disguising and implementing and profiting from their activities, often using the excuse that their business models and other tripe were necessary components of national security, doublespeak for cloaking criminal activity. The U.S. Navy was the tool used most consistently to promote this agenda, and its actions were directed by the British Crown and the British government, though the U.S. Navy, a municipal corporation, was used as the front for a great deal of the skullduggery. Ditto U.S. Army and USAF. They have been trying to set up the same sort of cozy nest to promote this same brand of criminality in China, hence all the cyber attacks and patent and copyright and trademark abuses that China has been committing. They have also made inroads in the Russian Navy, though the Russians have been far less amenable to manipulation. Thus the devil was cast down into the sea and has ruled for a short time. The Americans are standing with their feet planted on their land and soil again, operating in their unincorporated, that is, sovereign, capacity. All the stuff that these misanthropes accumulated, in our names, under the guise of managing and administering our assets for us have to be returned and revenued, and thence, all the ill-gotten similar gains have to be returned to the other victims. Not coincidentally, it is the double jubilee, and this time, no excuses can be offered by the Church and Queen for any failure to deliver a full measure of remedy and debt forgiveness at all levels. It's time.